The snow was falling the way ashes fall after a fire, drifting slow and soft, but heavy enough to bury a soul. The road that wound through the high valley had long since disappeared, hidden under drifts that pressed against the boots of a lone woman. Her shawl clung to her like a ragged shadow, damp with breath and melting frost. She pulled it tighter, though it gave little warmth. With each step, her chest heaved, steam rising from her lips as if she were some weary beast in winter. The world was white silence, except for the groan of wind through the pines and the crunch of her weight on frozen ground. Her name was Martha Jane, and she told herself she was walking away, though it often felt she was only walking in place, carrying the same shame mile after mile. The town had shut its doors against her. Their words rang louder than the storm. Useless, too soft, too slow, too much. A widow at 28 with nothing left but her own body, and even that was counted against her. She was a woman the world had decided to measure by the wrong scales. And the cruelest part was how she had come to believe it herself. Snow clung to her lashes. The lanterns of town had long vanished behind her, and the forest ahead loomed dark, as if it might swallow her whole. She whispered to no one. To the white expanse itself, "I ain't worth much." The sound of her voice startled her. It trembled, thin as paper, carried off by the wind. She bowed her head and trudged on. By the time her knees buckled, dusk had settled like a bruise across the mountains. She sank into the drift, breath shallow, shawl slipping from her shoulders. The storm pressed down, merciless, and she closed her eyes, not to rest, but to surrender. The silence welcomed her. She might have stayed there, another forgotten body beneath the snow, had not the crunch of deliberate footsteps broken through the storm. A shadow loomed above her, vast and solid. A man's voice, rough as bark, yet strangely gentle, cut through her fading thoughts. "Ma'am," a pause, then the scrape of gloves brushing snow from her sleeve. "You'll freeze out here." His arms corded with muscle and scarred with old labor, lifted her with the ease one might lift a child. She stirred, ashamed to be carried, but too weak to protest beyond a murmur. "Don't trouble yourself, sir. I ain't worth much." The man said nothing. His silence was not dismissive, but steady, like a log jam holding against the river. He only tightened his grip and began the long walk back through the snow. His cabin rose from the hillside as if carved from the very rock, smoke trailing from its chimney. The door groaned open beneath his hand, and warmth spilled out, a fire dancing in a hearth, the smell of pine pitch and old hides. He carried her across the threshold, set her down by the fire, and knelt to stir the embers. Light caught in his beard, thick and white stray in the tired creases of his eyes. His name, she would learn, was Gidodia Boone, though in that moment he was only a mountain shadow who had chosen not to let her die. The heat stung her skin like needles, reminding her she was still alive. She wanted to thank him, but shame caught in her throat. She was too heavy, too plain, too unwanted. She had heard the town's laughter enough times to know how she looked, slumped on another's floor. She pulled her shawl close and whispered almost angrily, "I'll be gone come morning." He did not answer. Instead, he placed an iron kettle over the flames. It's his filling the silence. He set a bowl and spoon on the table, but did not press them toward her. When the stew was ready, he ladled it into the bowl, set it down, and returned to mending a cracked rifle stock at the workbench. He left her to choose. The smell, venison, onion, wild herbs, tugged at her. Hunger, but she sat rigid, trembling with the old conviction that she did not deserve to eat. The minutes passed, the only sound the scrape of his knife and the pop of the fire. Finally, with hands shaking, she reached for the spoon. Each mouthful felt like rebellion, like proof she had not yet surrendered to their verdict of worthlessness. She ate in silence, afraid he might watch. But when she dared to glance, he was bent over his work, giving her the grace of being unseen. Night deepened. The storm clawed at the shutters. Jedediah set down his tools, poured tea into a tin cup, and placed it by her side without a word. She studied him then, the breadth of his shoulders, the calm gravity with which he moved, the faint limp in his stride. He was a man who had weathered worse winters than this, a man who had made his peace with solitude. And yet he had carried her here, though she had given him nothing but the burden of her weight. The memory of town nodded at her, sharp as cold. She remembered the women's smirks, the men's laughter in the saloon. She had been called greedy for taking seconds at supper, lazy for sitting while others scrubbed, foolish for marrying a man who left her nothing but debts. Every whisper had built a wall around her until she had come to believe she was more shadow than flesh. That shame clung to her now, even as firelight warmed her cheeks. She rose once, jaw wrapped tight, intent on leaving. The storm had calmed only a little. The world outside still a white void. Jedediah did not stop her. He simply pushed the door open and let the wind rush in as though to remind her what waited. The cold bit her face like knives. She lingered in the doorway, heart pounding. Behind her, the cabin glowed with firelight, and on the table still steamed the bowl of stew she had not finished. She closed the door slowly, leaned her back against it, and let her body sag. Shame had driven her into the storm. But something stronger than shame kept her from stepping into it again. He offered no victory smile, no sermon. He simply nodded once and returned to the hearth. As though her choice had been her own alone, days passed in this quiet rhythm. She mended small tears in her shawl with needle and thread she found in a box. She swept snow that crept under the door. When Jedediah came in from chopping wood, he left his boots by the fire without a word, and she set them closer, so the leather would dry. Each act was small, almost invisible, but each carried weight. She began to feel, if not useful, at least present, something she had not felt in years. Still, the outside world had teeth. One morning, Jedediah saddled his horse and rode into town for flour and salt. When he returned, his beard crusted with frost. He carried 2 sacks instead of 1. She asked why, though her voice shook, fearing the answer. He said, "Only, snow's heavy this year. Better stocked than sorry." She did not ask further, but later as she stirred the stew, she realized he had bought enough for both of them, as if her presence here were not temporary at all. It unsettled her more than comforted her. To be counted in another's plans was a dangerous kind of hope. In the hush of evening, she caught him watching her hands as she folded her shawl, not with hunger, not with judgment, but with a stillness that unnerved her. She turned away, cheeks burning. "I ain't worth much," she murmured again, the old refrain tumbling out before she could stop it. She expected silence as always. Instead, his voice low and steady, carried across the room. "Ma'am, you've yet to see what I see." The words landed heavy like an axe splitting wood. She gripped the shawl tighter, heart thutu. She wanted to ask what he saw, but fear of the answer kept her lips sealed. The fire popped, and outside the storm gathered strength once more. The room was filled with warmth and the promise of something unnamed. Suspended between them like breath in cold air, she sat down slowly, feeling the weight of his words settle in her chest. For the first time in years, she wondered if the world measure of her worth had been wrong all along. And as the snow pressed harder against the cabin walls, she understood she was no longer merely surviving the winter. She was standing on the edge of something that could change her life forever. Morning came pale and thin, the sun rising weak behind curtains of ice that hung from the cabin's eaves. Martha Jane stirred from her cot near the hearth. The fire burned low, embers glowing like a bed of rubies. The storm had eased, leaving a silence almost holy. Yet the hush carried a weight, as though the world itself was waiting to see whether she would stay or vanish back into the void she had tried to claim. Jedediah Boone moved about quietly, setting logs on the fire, his steps measured, his presence steady as stone. He did not look at her when he spoke. "Coffee's hot," a simple offering. Yet in his voice there was no pity, no doubt. She nodded, fingers trembling as she took the tin cup, the warmth seeping into her hands like life returning. Days found rhythm. She swept, cooked, mended, though never because he asked her to. He carried wood, trapped rabbits, cut hide into strips. When she reached to help him one evening, he simply shifted aside, letting her take the task without comment. She sewed a tear in his coat by lantern light, the needle glinting in her careful hands. He wore it the next morning as if it had never been torn. Not a word spoken, but his silence brimmed with acknowledgement. In each act, in each quiet exchange, she began to feel a presence growing inside her. Not pride, not yet, but the faintest stirrings of worth. One night the wolves came. Their howls echoed down from the ridges, sharp as knives circling the cabin in the dark. Martha's breath caught in her throat. She had heard tales of wolves dragging men from saddles, of children gone in a blink. Panic coiled in her chest. She felt useless again, dead weight in a place where survival demanded strength. Jedediah lifted his rifle, checked the powder, and looked at her. Not harsh, not fearful, but steady. "Hold the lantern," he said, handing it into her shaking grasp. She wanted to refuse, but his eyes held hers with a quiet certainty, as if he knew she would not fail. She stepped to the doorway as he pushed it open, wind rushing in, and held the light high. Wolves darted at the edge of vision, eyes glowing like embers, bodies slinking through snow. Jed fired once, the sound rolling into the mountains, and the pack broke apart, shadows fleeing into deeper dark. Through it all, she held the lantern steady, her arm aching, the flames shuddering, but never dying. When he closed the door and set the rifle aside, he gave a single nod. "Strong hands," he said, and though the words were few, they set something blazing in her chest. Winter tightened, supplies dwindled, and Jed rode down into town more often. Each time, Martha feared what the people whispered. She knew how they looked at her, lips curled, voices low, judging every pound of her body, every choice she had made. One afternoon, she dared to follow him. The streets were crusted with snow, shutters rattling in the wind. She fell, eyes on her as she walked behind him, keeping her head down, shawl clutched at her throat. At the Morantile, a man leaning by the stove sneered loud enough for all to hear. "Boone, you feeding two mouse now. Seems one of them could stand to eat less." Laughter rippled cruel and sharp. Martha froze, shame searing her. Jedediah set down the sack of flour. He held and turned. His voice was low but carried through the room like thunder rumbling over ridges. "Best watch your words." He did not shout. He did not strike. But his gaze burned so steady that the man faltered, clearing his throat and looking away. Jed picked up the sack again, calm as ever, and walked past. Martha followed, cheeks burning, tears pricking, but in her chest pulled something strange, a sense that someone had stood, not for her as a burden, but for her, as if she were worth standing for. That night, she could not sleep. She rose, pacing by the embers, clutching her shawl. The words spilled from her lips in a whisper. "I shouldn't be here. I'm ruining his name. I ain't worth the trouble." She began to pack her few things. Needle, thread, the worn shawl, nothing else. The sound of the door latch turned her head. Jedediah stood in the doorway. Hair wild from sleep, shoulders filling the frame. He did not scold. He did not plead. He simply stepped forward, lifted the small bundle from her hands, and set it aside. Then he placed her mittens back into her palms. His voice was a low rumble, steady as always. "Then let me trouble myself because you're worth everything to me." The words struck like a hammer. She could not speak, only stood trembling, tears spilling silent. For the first time, she believed he meant them. The days that followed changed her. She hummed as she cooked, laughter escaping unbidden when a rabbit stew boiled over and Jed only shook his head, smiling faintly. She spoke more freely, telling stories of her mother's garden, of her father's fiddle, of the days before shame had stolen her tongue. Jed listened, not with polite nods, but with the patience of a man who valued each word. Slowly she began to see herself through his eyes. Not as burden, not as jest, but as presence, as companion, as light. Then came the blizzard. It roared down from the peaks, sudden and merciless, burying trails, toppling trees, smothering the world in white. Word spread that a group of townsfolk caught returning from a trading run had not made it back. Martha's chest tightened with fear. Jed gathered rope, lanterns, blankets. She reached for her shawl, her mittens. "I'm coming." He looked at her, measuring, then nodded once. They stepped into the storm together. The wind howled, tearing at their clothes, snow biting at exposed skin. They tied themselves with rope, Jed leading, Martha holding the lantern high. The beam of light cut through the blizzard like a blade, guiding them forward. They found the first wagon half buried, horses collapsed, men huddled inside, faces pale with frost. Jed hauled them out, but it was Martha who pressed blankets around their shoulders, who lifted a child into her arms and held him close to her chest until his trembling eased. They pressed on, finding more stranded folk. Each life pulled from the snow a battle against the storm itself. Her arms ACHD, her breath burned, yet she never let the lantern fall. By the time they stumbled back to the cabin, the group staggering behind them, Martha was more exhausted than she had ever been. But she felt a fire within her that no wind could smother. In the days that followed, whispers in town shifted. Folks spoke of the mountain man and the woman who had braved the storm, who had held the light that led them all home. Some still sneered, some still mocked, but their words no longer pierced as they once had. Martha knew now in her marrow that worth was not what they said, but what she had done, what she continued to do. She had stood in the storm and not faltered. The fire crackled in the hearth one evening, shadows dancing on the cabin walls. Jed sat across from her, sharpening his knife, eyes calm, steady as ever. She sewed by the lantern. The sound of thread pulling through cloth a rhythm of its own. The silence between them was no longer heavy, but full, rich with all that had been shared. She looked up, caught his gaze, and for the first time did not look away. "You were wrong," she said softly. His brow lifted waiting. Her lips trembled, but the words came clear. "I am worth much." The corners of his mouth shifted, not quite a smile, but something deeper. He set aside the knife, leaned forward, and in the quiet of that winter night, the truth hung between them like a promise. Outside the snow lay thick, the world hushed and white. Inside, the fire burned, warm and steady, as though it might never die. And in the glow of that fire, Martha Jane understood that dignity was not given by others, nor stolen by gossip, but found in the light one carried through the darkest storm. She had held the lantern and in doing so had lit her own way.